Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. A vendor in your vendor master file is inactive, and for good reason, because the last time your company paid that vendor was 4 years ago. Now your company wants to use that vendor again. Don't just change the status. That can lead to failed payments and bad vendor data. Why and what should you do instead? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 351. What to do when your company wants to do business with an inactive vendor. Now, this actually happens all the time, or can happen all the time. Now, many of you know that I used to be a practitioner. I had a team of 17. The only thing we did was vendor setup and maintenance. And so we had 140,000 vendors across 7 ERPs. And I will tell you that when we cleaned our vendor master file, by the way, we used to do it on a monthly basis. When we clean our vendor master file, the first step is always to inactivate vendors that your company has not done business with in, 15, 18, 24 months, 36 months, whatever activity threshold works best for your company. I will tell you that we started off with 18 months and we reduced it down to 15 months only because that results in less active vendors, which means that there are less vendors or active vendors that your internal fraudsters can target and that your external fraudsters can target. So those inactive vendors, those are vendors where the information that's on their vendor record really can't be considered active. You can consider them stale if you haven't done business with that vendor at your inactivity threshold. So if you send the payment out, may fail, may come back, right? And so you want to make sure that you're inactivating those vendors. And when you're inactivating those vendors, you're really looking at 4 areas of inactivity. So look at invoice activity, definitely look at payment activity. Also look at purchase order activity, and you also want to make sure, especially in the purchase orders, that there are no open purchase orders, because you can't even inactivate a vendor if they're open purchase orders anyway. But then the other areas, you want to look at the modification of the vendor record, because a lot of times when vendors haven't done business with a company in a while and all of a sudden now, they need their widgets. They know that their information has been updated, and so they'll send a request in to change. So I would always look at, in addition to any transactional activities like the PO, the invoice, and the payment activity I just talked about. I would also look at the vendor record modification, like the last time the vendor record was modified. I would look at that activity as well. And, I do this all the time. I got lost in what I was originally talking about, but uh, when you're inactivating your vendors, you're doing it for a reason because you can no longer uh, uh, validate or no longer be sure that that information is accurate. And so we call that, or I call that, stale vendor information. And so those vendors need to be inactivated. And again, this is something that when I was a practitioner, my team used to do on a monthly basis. And in out of those 7 ERPs, I think it was only 2 that actually did the inactivation process automatically. Like it would find those vendors that met that threshold. And so the other ones, it was all manual. So if you're still have a manual process, no worries, you can still get that done. You just need to make time to do it. And so this is something that we did on a monthly basis because, as you can imagine, with that many vendors, if we waited to do it just on an annual basis, how many vendors that would be, the volume would be much higher. Research on vendors would be a lot higher. And so it's actually easier to do it on a monthly basis than to do it on an annual basis. But anyway, I kind of got lost in what I was talking about because I always go off on a tangent. But the gist of what I just said is you want to make sure you're inactivating your vendors. Now, one of the things we used to find when we inactivated those vendors is that no matter when we did it, what month we did it didn't matter. And we always did it on a Saturday because one of our systems, no one could be in the system while that automatic process was working or was running. And so we would do that on a Saturday. And I will tell you, there was always at least one person that was looking at least one of those vendors that we inactivated on Saturday. They were looking at that vendor on Friday and then going home going, good, I'll create a PO on Monday, and then they come in on Monday and that vendor is inactivated. So if your company wants to do business with a vendor whose status is inactive, this is what you should do. And this, it doesn't matter whether the vendor was just inactivated, as in the example I just talked about, or if the vendor was inactivated years ago, but right, you still have to keep that vendor record on file. You need to make sure that you are treating that vendor like a new vendor. And so, what do I mean by that? Treating inactive vendors as new vendors. I mean that you need to, one, collect all the same documentation as you do from a new vendor, and two, to do the validations, the same validations that you would as a new vendor. And so let's talk about the first one. So the first one is to request the same supporting documentation that you do for a new vendor. So this means if it is a U.S. vendor, you're going to collect a W-9 form. If it is a non-U.S. vendor, you're going to collect a W-8 form. And let's go back to the W-9 form because this is the part that I love. W-9 forms, the IRS, since it published or created the W-9 form back in 1983. Do you know they have updated that thing 20 times? But the thing about it is that when the IRS comes out with a new revision, you don't have to go back to all your existing vendors unless you know that their legal name tax ID combination doesn't match. You don't have to go back to them and request a new W-9 because the IRS issued or published a revision. And so this is an excellent time to collect the most updated version because when you are onboarding new vendors, you always collect the most updated version of the W-9 form and all of the IRS forms actually, right? But you collect the most recent version of the W-9 form. And in this case, if you hadn't already collected the W-9 form with the revision date of March 2024, it's a perfect time to do it. And you do want to collect it because there are some significant updates. For example, the 2014 revision introduced the FATCA certification. And this most recent revision, again, March 2024, included or added a new checkbox for certain tax classification types to identify if that vendor has any ownership in your company and has foreign owners or beneficiaries. So you definitely want to make sure if that's a checkbox that pertains to your company, like if your company is a partnership, trust, or estate, it might be something that is beneficial for you to collect from your vendor. So you definitely want to make sure you're collecting the most recent version. And now that the vendor is inactive and wants to be active again, it's the perfect time to do it. So make sure you're collecting the same forms, including the W-9, the applicable W-8 forms, as you do for a new vendor. And that also includes banking details. And so maybe when you were collecting or setting that vendor up originally, you weren't using your own company branded vendor banking form, but now you are because you have updated your process and you've added some internal controls, some requirements for authenticating data on the form. And it's a perfect time to collect that information from your vendor, especially if during your inactivation process, and I don't talk about this a lot, you removed the vendor's banking details. So, that uh, sensitive information is not still on the vendor master file, even though that vendor is inactive. And so you collect the banking information on your company branded vendor banking form as if it were a new vendor, but you're collecting that information with authenticating data, such as their EIN, the vendor that or not the vendor, but the internal team member that they have a relationship with, right? All these things that I talk about that should be on your company branded vendor banking form. And I think I did a podcast about that before. I did, and it was episode number 296, and it's called Two Company Branded Vendor Forms You Need. Part 2 was the vendor banking form. And so I do go through everything that I think you need to include on your company branded vendor banking form to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. All right, so that's the vendor banking form, then the IRS form. So we've talked about that. And then the other thing, too, that you can collect if needed is a copy of the invoice or contract. And getting the contract is a great idea anyway because it has the payment terms on it. And I will tell you, when I was a practitioner, that was one of the biggest things that we rarely ever got us into trouble because we would have default payment terms for our vendors unless they had a contract, and we would never know if they had a contract or not. And so that we would always default to the payment terms, and come to find out the contract payment terms was much shorter, which we wouldn't find out until the vendor called looking for their payment. So copy of the contract would be great. Also a copy of the invoice. Now the contract could have this on there too, but if there is a remit address that is different than the W-9 address, or there's a purchasing address that's different than the W-9 address, then you need to collect that either on the contract or an invoice so you can add that to the vendor record. Now, a lot of times, the W-9 address is is a tax address. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I do recommend, though, that you collect your own vendor setup form as well, or combine that with the W-9 form. And why is that? Because you get more addresses. So, yes, you can collect an invoice that has a remit address if that's different than the W-9. Yes, you can get a purchase order address or a remit address from the contract. But you know what? If you have your own vendor setup form, and you can put or collect whatever information you know you may need. That can include a purchasing address, a remit address. I like to have a physical address requirement on there because sometimes the W-9 address might be a PO box, and it's actually nothing wrong with collecting a PO box. The key is that you do need to make sure that you're always also collecting a physical address. And that is only because, and I'm sure you know this, is that if a vendor only has a PO address or you only collect a PO address, that's a red flag that it could be a fraudulent vendor because they like to hide behind PO boxes. So I love the fact that if you're collecting a vendor setup form, love the fact that you can do that and collect more information than what is available on the W-9 form. And if you are doing that and collecting both, consider creating a substitute form, which the IRS does allow you to do. You can combine your vendor setup form with the W-9 required fields based on the IRS instructions for a substitute W-9 form. And so that really gives you one form you have to collect from your vendor. And a tip here is do not call it a substitute W-9 form, just call it a vendor setup form. And if the vendor wants to attach their own W-9 to it, they can. No problem with that. But you are compliant with once you have collected the vendor setup form. And if you call it a substitute W-9 form, the vendors are going to say, well, I already have a W-9 form. I'll just give you that and we'll fill out all this, all this extra information that you're asking for. And so, even though it has a lot of other information and they know it's more information than what's on the W-9, they still just want to give that to you because that form is called the substitute W-9. Just call it a vendor setup form, and you and the IRS will know that it is a substitute W-9 form. Now, for that matter, you can do the same thing with W-8s as well, and it might even work better with foreign vendors because they never know how to fill out those W-8s. And when you create a substitute W-8 form, it you can use user-friendly terms. You can even, put it in a different language, right, for your vendor, for your foreign vendors. And so you can do both. And I do have training sessions on creating a substitute W-9 form and substitute W-8 forms. And so I will put links to those in the show notes. All right, so those are examples of forms I recommend you collect when you're creating new vendors and when you are reactivating vendors. Because why? You want to get all the information, most updated information from the vendors, just like you would do for a new vendor. Because what's the reason you inactivated them in the first place? Because that information is now stale. You haven't made payments to them. You haven't issued generated purchase orders. You haven't received invoices. And so that information was considered stale when you inactivated them. So now you have to get new information or updated information from the vendor. And it doesn't even mean that it changed, but you need to know that it didn't change. And that is a great segue to step 2, which is to do all the same validations for the existing or inactive vendor as you do for new vendors. And that's because, right, you are getting all the same information in, so you do need to do the same validations. And so that includes the IRS 10 match, uh, and that is whether they have a W-8 or W-9, as long as they have an IRS tax ID. And you want to make sure that there have been no changes to the legal name tax ID combination, right? And this prevents future IRS penalties or interest, or having to, back up withhold because you do not have a valid legal name tax ID combination, and you definitely don't want the IRS finding that out and telling you during or after tax season when you get your CP 2100 or 2100A notification that tells you that you made or that you filed tax forms for vendors or with vendors' legal name and tax ID combinations that didn't match. So you definitely want to make sure you do that. You also, and I don't know if I mentioned it in the first one, where you're collecting supporting documentation. But if you have like a foreign vendor that has other tax registration numbers or just registration numbers in general, because there are countries that have, registration numbers is not all about the IRS tax IDs. And so you want to make sure that you're collecting what is relevant for that country, and then perform any applicable validations during this step. And then a great example of that, actually two. One is the GST tax, like for India. I know it's for other countries as well. Same thing for VAT, the value added tax, right? That's one that's pretty popular because it is for Euro vendors. And so you want to make sure that you're validating that collecting them and then validating that those numbers, tax numbers or vendor registration numbers are still valid. Now, some of those registration numbers don't all have resources to validate them. And if you are a vendor process training pass member, you have access to the global vendor registration numbers. So you have access to um, global vendor registration numbers for 120 or 100 plus countries. And not only will it give you a link to validate those registration numbers where you can validate them, but if you can't validate them because the country just doesn't offer that, there's a column in that file that will tell you what the number should look like. So it'll tell you how many digits it should be, whether it's alphanumerical, and then it'll give you an example of that. So make sure you check that out. If you're not a Vendor Process Training Pass member, I actually do have that for sale separately along with the vendor banking form. I'll put links to both of those in the show notes. Man, it's going to be a lot of notes on this one. All right. So do your validations, either the IRS 10 match for U.S. or non-U.S. vendors that have an IRS tax ID, or if they don't have an IRS tax ID, collect and validate that country or that country for your vendor, their registration number, whatever it may be. And then the next thing you want to do is definitely do your exclusion list because you want to make sure that the vendors are not on any exclusion list that you care about or you need to make sure that you're following. And so the one that comes to mind you should know about is OFAC. That's a set of exclusion lists. And so I should say it this way, as a U.S. Individual or entity, you are excluded from paying vendors that appear right on those lists. And so you want to make sure you collect, you do that validation. Also, if the vendor is a non-US vendor or foreign vendor and that you would be making payments to a foreign financial institution, you need to check that foreign financial institution as well. And if you are not performing the OFAC check, right? Or maybe you're only doing it at vendor onboarding time and you think, well, we did it when they were onboarded, so we don't need to do it again. But those lists are not static, they change all the time. And so you want to make sure that when you're reactivating a vendor, or for that matter, when you're uh, making changes to an existing active vendor, you want to check it then, and also check them on a recurring basis. That's another reason why when I was a practitioner, we used to clean our vendor master file on a monthly basis, because we also did the exclusion list revalidation to make sure those vendors that we checked, last month, or we just onboarded last month, to make sure they haven't subsequently been added to an exclusion list, because we didn't want to take the chance on being issued civil penalties and criminal penalties. And if you take a look at the OFAC site, not only can you search for your vendors on those exclusion lists there, but one of the pages has a running list of all of the companies that have been penalized for paying vendors that are on these exclusion lists, and those penalties are in the millions. So if you're, gung ho about doing the IRS 10 match, be the same way about these OFAC lists. And it's not just about the OFAC exclusion list. There are other exclusion lists as well. For example, if you are a federal, local, state government entity, you need to check sam.gov to make sure that any vendor that you want to pay is not on that exclusion list. Same as if you are a healthcare entity, you want to check on the Office of Inspector General, their exclusion list, to make sure that your vendor has not been excluded from getting Medicaid or Medicare payments. So you want to make sure that you know which validations apply to your company. Don't just use what another company used, maybe a colleague. Don't just do those validations. Do the validations, determine which ones are valid for your company, and then do yours. Now, if you want a custom vendor validation review, I will put a link also in the show notes. Actually, that one's already there, where you can sign up for a custom vendor validation session. And at the same time, you can download a vendor validation resource list with links. And so you can look at some of the most frequent common vendor validations and use those resource links to perform those if you're not already doing it. Wow, for this episode, there are a lot of links in the show notes or the description that actually can help you, but it's a lot this time. All right, so I think that's it. What to do when your company wants to do business with an inactive vendor? Well, two things: request supporting documentation, and then two, perform validations. Now, I may not have talked about some validations that you may do that, may be unique to your company, or maybe I just didn't mention it, but make sure that whatever documents and validations that you require and perform of your new vendors, that you do it for your inactive vendors as well. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is reactivating that specific vendor record. You need to make sure that the existing registration number, whether it's an IRS tax ID or a VAT number or a GST number, that should be the unique number that is on that vendor record. Now, I know there are some systems like SAP where you can't do that because you have to have multiple vendor records, but most accounting systems and ERPs can limit the vendor record to only having one unique tax ID or registration number. Now, when you get the new information from that vendor, now remember, their information can be stale. Maybe they were merged, maybe they were acquired by someone else, maybe, right, they took the time in between, right, to change some of their information. If their tax ID changed, your registration number changed, that needs to be a new vendor record. Do not override it because the payment activity needs to follow the registration number. Whether it's a tax ID or that, it needs to follow the registration number. If they just change their name, that's fine. You can override the vendor's legal name, but you should not override the tax ID or registration number. So if the tax ID or registration number is different, create a new vendor record and let that existing inactive vendor record stay as it is. If there was no change to the vendor registration number, be it tax ID, VAT number, GST, then you can make any other changes on that vendor record that you need to, the vendor legal name, remittance information, I don't know, purchase order address, right? You can make those changes on that existing vendor record and then change the status to active. All right, so thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 351st episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.